Hi, Perry.
Hi, Andy.
How are you
Thank you very
doing?
much. Yeah, fine, thank you. And you?
Very, very good, thank you. It's really good to see
Good.
you. Can I ask you to start just by introducing yourself and giving us an overview of your work, please?
That sounds really grand. Okay, my name is Perry Mills. I'm a secondary school teacher, English teacher, and I'm a deputy head at the moment at King Edward VI School, which is an all-boys grammar school in Stratford-on-Avon, 11 to 18. 11 to 16, it's all boys, and then we have girls in the sixth form, and it's about 740 students at the moment. And it's sometimes known as Shakespeare's School because we're about 50 yards up the road from the RSC. I suppose the thing that you're probably more interested in is the fact that for about 10 or 12, it's difficult to say how long, years, I've been running this group called Edward's Boys. We are an all-boys theatre company, and the repertoire focuses almost exclusively on those plays that were written at the late 16th, early 17th century for boys' companies. So we do it all boy, and we do boys' company plays. Yeah, that's it.
Great, and I guess we should say, for people not in the know, that in Shakespeare's lifetime, a little bit before and a little bit after, there are these alternative kinds of theatre companies to the ones that Shakespeare's working in. Shakespeare's company, all male, with predominantly adult performers and maybe a couple of boy performers. But the plays you're referring to come from companies which are entirely made up of boy players. In the very early period, quite young boy players, as the period develops, often stretching into their 20s. And that specific kind of theatre company that you're picking up on today.
That's right. And I mean, the thing about age is really interesting because when we started, I remember a very eminent academic saying to me after the first show that we'd done, which was Marston's Dutch Courtesan, I'm being very supportive, but saying, actually, you've got the age wrong, because boy means boy. Boy means unbroken voices. And Dutch courtesans are around 1605, I think. And probably by then, they were, as you say, stretching into late teens, maybe early 20s. I mean, there are different definitions, as you're aware, of what boy meant in that period. And if it did include, for example, apprentices, then it could easily go up to 23, 24, I think something like that. And maybe one of the things that we've been able to not so much show, but at least indicate is that age range was broader than some scholars had thought, because it can work when you've got older boys and younger boys working together.
Great, thank you. And I guess one of the questions there is about this idea of getting it right, and also what emerges from getting it wrong. Is really important, because often scholars engage with performance and they want to see something very specifically meeting their own vision of historical process. And actually what's often exciting is when it doesn't do that, and what discovery that enables. Go on, sorry.
Sorry, no, it's a crucial point, but go on, before we get on to that.
Well, before we go any further, I feel like I should say how extraordinary Edward's Boys' work is and has been for all audiences. I've sat watching your shows in audiences made up predominantly of of non-academics who are just loving what they're seeing, but speaking as an academic who spends their career worrying about, thinking about, being excited about plays from this period. It's been really transformative to watch not just what the boys are doing, but the ideas that you yourself bring to those shows. I'm really looking forward to talking through them now, but it's been truly transformative of how we think about theatre from that time, I think. So I want to make sure I say that before we go any further.
Well,
you haven't got to respond to that. I know how strongly you reject any form of praise, but there you have something.
it's a self-awareness, Andy. But I will say, in return, there's absolutely no way that we would have started this without the support of academics, and I mean right at the beginning, Carol Rutter at Warwick University, who came up with the idea of exploring what it was like when boys try to play female roles, and does it work, and does it still work, and so on. So the support of Carol, and then many academics, and you're one of those, chief amongst those, who've been supportive all the way through, and given guidance, but also just sheer encouragement, because at first it seems such an odd thing to do. Now it's got a bit of a momentum and some sort of reputation. And it's odd, because thinking back in those early days, sometimes it was quite shocking for audiences, and the boys themselves are often trying to seek that shock because they've heard of it. But now, quite often, audiences come along, and they know what to expect. Oh, they're doing it. Oh boy. Oh, it's that kind of play. But the thanks is mutual, because the encouragement and support from people like you has been huge.
Great, thank you. Well, that's what these films are all about, is people swapping their enthusiasm for each other's work and learning from each other. So that's really fine, thank you. You've raised the issue of boys playing women, and we had a discussion before we made this film about what my first Edward's Boys production was. And I'm still pretty sure it was Chaste, Maid and Cheapside, where actually the big revelation from that production was less boys playing women and more boys playing boys and boys playing men, particularly in a play which is so invested in. So this is a play by Thomas Middleton, A Chaste, Maid and Cheapside, a play which is strongly invested in the various meanings of the male body and the commerce of people's bodies in a. And I always think of it as a kind of play very similar to the British TV show Wife Swap, but substituting husband swap. And you've mentioned The Dutch Courtesan as your first production. These are very stridently, explicitly, and proudly out there plays. Do you mind telling us a bit about what that feels like, both to rehearse and to perform?
There's so many things to touch on there. I mean, perhaps the first thing is to talk about the whole thing about boys playing female roles. Just quickly, it was something that we explored for some time with Carol. First of all, with extracts from Shakespeare and non-Shakespeare plays, and then we actually did some scenes from Epicene, The Silent Woman, which is something we might talk about again later on. And actually came to the conclusion pretty early on that it's not that interesting. It's not that shocking. Boys can play female roles. Women can play male roles. And it's not about getting it right. It's different people, different performers bring different things. So that was an interesting, but actually it sort of run its course. And so I think you're quite right with Chaste, Maid. By there, it wasn't the chief thing. One of the things that often happens when we perform in front of largely academic audiences is that there's a Q&A session at the end. And generally, nobody's interested in asking me a question. They're much more interested, of course, in asking the boys. And the first question is always, what's it like playing a female role? And the answer is, it's fine. It's just another role. I'm not a king either. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a man. And actually, as those people who do a lot of performance know, it's actually quite difficult playing something that's close to your own age or whatever it is. So playing a 15-year-old boy in a show is really quite tricky. So it's just about being another person and trying to play the character rather than what you think a girl should look like, or the way a woman should walk or something. When you say about out there, of course, one of the weird things about these plays that were specifically written for the boys' companies is that most of them are either very, very violent and bloody. I'm thinking of something like Antonio's Revenge by Marston, or utterly filthy. And that seemed to puzzle some people early on, and why is that? But of course, there's no surprise at all, is it? Boys can revel in violence and sexual innuendo just like grown-ups can. So occasionally audiences are a bit shocked by some of the stuff that goes on in the plays, but the boys aren't. And the way we approach it always is from textual analysis. I've said at the start I'm an English teacher, and that's the only way I can envisage putting a play on. So we do lots and lots of text bashing for weeks early on, where we sit around the table. It's like the most boring English lesson you can imagine, and we work on what we think it means. And I mean that, obviously, I'm more experienced than most of the boys. I've got an English degree. I've in some cases, these plays have been published, so there are half a page of notes at the bottom. But we don't always follow that. The whole thing is about what it means or what it might mean. So as we're going through, everybody pitches in ideas about what these words and phrases might mean. So what I'm saying is that whatever it's talking about, whether it's talking about sexual innuendo or jealousy or violence or psychological disturbance or whatever, we are talking about it and exploring it and thinking about it. And so, yeah, there may be laughter in the rehearsal room, seldom embarrassment, and then we move on. And then it's a question, of course, of trying to find the right way, the right mode of presenting that on stage. And it's always another key question, which is about original practices. I don't know what that phrase means. There probably are scholars across the world who know precisely what it means, but I've never discovered it myself. I don't think we could put a play on where we were thinking, right, how were they thinking in 1609 or 1598? It wouldn't work. What we do is do it all boy, and that's really the only concession. We don't cut much. We tend to leave in difficult words and phrases and try and make them clear to the audience. The most important thing is to try to make it work for an audience in 2020. Yeah. And that may be that we do it in period costume, or it may be that we choose a different period. And the reason for that will be to try to illuminate in a way what's going on. You yourself have just made a contemporary reference to a television program, and those sorts of things can illuminate and help to give an audience a context that they can latch onto. But it's all about trying to make it work for today, to put a show on for today. If, when that happens, there are occasional glimpses that people might say, that's interesting, I hadn't thought it might be like that, or yeah, that's exactly how it was in my mind, then that's absolutely great. But that's not our motive when we're doing it. We just want to make the audience have a good time.
Great, thank you again. There's lots to unpack there.
Sorry.
Yeah, I too never really know if I understand what original practice means, but it's an idea and a term that became particularly popular, I presume, in the 1990s, particularly around reconstructions of Elizabethan theatrical spaces like the Globe in London and the Blackfriars in Stanton, Virginia. And has done some really wonderful and exciting work. But I suppose that you're opposing original practices implicitly there to the idea of making it work for the audience now. And I can't think of anything closer to the original practice of early modern drama than privileging the live audience experience now. So kind of it's interesting to think about how those things end up in tension. And you also talked about text bashing, if I may use your amazing phrase. And again, I like the idea of asking what it might mean, because I think a lot of people think performance is all about taking a text and doing what it says, and bowing to academic readings of what the text says. Whereas going in and asking that question of what it might mean, I think is really exciting. So could you just give us an example of how that process of text bashing, of unpacking a text, asking what it might mean, then leads to something happening on stage?
Yeah, and it's I suppose I should start by saying, sometimes there isn't an authoritative text published. There isn't the Arden edition or the Revels edition or whatever it might be, and therefore I either have to borrow one from a tame academic who's worked on it, or download something from the internet, which of course then is full of errors and all sorts of punctuation problems. Actually, that gave us a huge amount of confidence in the early days when we picked up texts where we thought, actually, we can change the punctuation here if we want to make something mean something different. I mean, the only play we've ever done where I've put my name on the poster, I've put adapted by Perry Mills, which was a bit of a cheek, was Westwood Ho. So Westwood Ho is, as you will know, Andy, a play by Thomas Dekker and John Webster, from this kind of high point in the early 1600s, sort of 1605 or so. Absolutely bonkers play, terribly smutty, all about sort of dirty weekends down in Brentford and so on. And it struck me as really very similar to sort of Carry On films. But with that play and the text I had, we had real problems. Characters changed their names in the course of the play, the indication of their names. Certain plot lines just didn't get finished off. I mean, I'm sure that somewhere somebody knows how this play should work, but it gave us a huge amount of confidence, and me, to sort of start to mess about with it a bit and change it and put in little bits and add things. Now, you know, you've got to be careful with that, and I'd be more circumspect about changing things quite so radically if it was a sort of play like Marston's The Malcontent or something by Ben Jonson. But with that play, it gave us a huge license to play, to use that word, which is a really important word for us. We play around all the time. I suppose a better example is when we were asked by Jenny Richards and Andrew Hadfield of the Nash Project, Thomas Nash Project, to have a go at Summer's Last Will and Testament. So Thomas Nash, Summer's Last Will and Testament, his only solo authored play, as far as anyone knows, sort of 1592. They actually know where it was performed, at a hall down in Croydon, which amazingly still stands. It's part of an independent girls' school now. And the original offer came from Jenny and Andrew and said, look, you know, will you do this? And we'd love you to put it on in this hall in Croydon to see what it was like. So there's kind of, oh, wow, you know, the resonances of that are extraordinary. And I said yes without having read the play. And then once I'd agreed, everybody, including, I think, Jenny and Andrew, were saying it's a terrible play. It's full of long speeches. It makes no sense at all. It's utterly repetitive. And the word everyone used was completely untheatrical. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one eminent scholar said at a study day down at the Globe before we did it, it was in the May, before we did it in the autumn, for a comedy, it's not very funny. And so we had a huge amount of bad press even before we started rehearsing it.
People asking you to do it.
Yeah, it was very strange. But actually, the moment we started to read it round, read it out loud, which is how we always work, the voices of these characters absolutely came alive. And I'd thought at the beginning, well, okay, very long speeches, we might do a bit of cutting, a bit of heavy cutting. And in fact, it was very often the boys were saying, no, we've got to keep this in, because everyone realized that you would change radically the rhythms of the play if you started taking loads and loads of lines out of speeches that were supposed to be long. And in the end, I think we did find theatrical context and equivalence and ways of doing that play that for a start showed that it was very, very funny. Audiences did seem to laugh a lot. I seem to think that you saw it, Andy, down in Croydon. So, you know, also it was terribly, terribly sad. This play is a great deal to do with death, and coincidentally to do with the time of plague. And that being performed by young performers, and particularly some were 11 and 12 years old, was pretty heartbreaking. I remember a number of people coming up at the end, tears in their eyes, at the thing. But the other thing I'd like to say about that play is it's hugely theatrical. Thomas Nash really understood what theatre meant, and I think one of the things the Nash Project has also discovered, and will celebrate is the fact that his prose is hugely theatrical as well. So maybe that's an example of the kind of thing that we do. We went in without preconceptions, simply reading the play aloud and listening to the voices that come out, and then trying to find our way through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever I hear scholars describe a play as untheatrical, I always want to say, how do you know? How do you know from sitting in a chair reading it whether or not it also reminds me of my regular bugbear that comedy does not need to mean funny, although it can mean that as well.
No.
The things we impose on that particular word. I was lucky enough to see work in progress on that production, which you brought to the University of Roehampton the summer before you staged it properly. And it was amazing watching you engage with the audience and watching for how audiences respond, because that's the heart of what we mean by the word theatrical, right? And that's what often we think we can't see when we're reading it on the page, but of course we can't see it when we read it on the page, because it's not
the audience. It's that session that we did for you at your conference was, as you know, because I put something on your blog, the Before Shakespeare blog, about this. It was hugely important because although we felt we'd got a way of presenting this play, and we were excited. I came down with 3 of the older lads, as you remember, all of them around about 18, playing major parts inevitably. And we weren't particularly clear about what we were planning to do in that workshop. The key thing was that the audience really engaged. I mean, to the point of actually joining in when we invited people to stand in for other characters and things. But certainly in terms of laughter at times, if you will remember that we took it outside, being a play for late autumn. It was such a beautiful day, probably August, September time, wasn't it? But also afterwards, when we had the Q&A indoors, and the scholars, all of you, seemed genuinely interested and engaged, rather than the idea it's a bunch of kids just messing about, and that gave those 3 lads a huge amount of confidence that we can make this play work. And then going back to the rest of the company and saying, this is how it worked down in Roehampton, we can do this. And I have to say, of course, part of it, Summer's Last Will and Testament, nobody has really done it since 1592, and in many of the plays that we do, they haven't been done at all, or very, very rarely. And that does give you a sort of bunker mentality. There is the idea of, people think this can't be done, let's have a go. Just occasionally we've almost fallen off the high wire. I don't think many people are going to do the Ladies' Trial again, but that's a play by Ford, which is 1638, something like that, and it was a very different kind of boys' company and a rather strange and complex play. But part of it is the pleasure in taking something and trying to make it work when there's a genuine feeling that it can't possibly work.
Yeah, thank you. And I should say, for all John Ford scholars and fans listening, that Perry Mills's views do not represent the views of A Bit Lit. Trying to get myself out of there. I love what you're saying, and I guess again, one of the reasons that you guys make it work is the brilliant things you bring to it, but also that people like Nash knew what they were doing, and on the page is merely conceptual philosophizing about age and death feels very different when you insert those ideas and those worries and those laments and those jokes into human bodies, and particularly human bodies which are defined by their age in relation to the audience's age and their age in relation to the boy who stood next to them. And you mentioned earlier the difficulties of a 15-year-old boy playing a 15-year-old boy. And I guess that is maximized if the 15-year-old boy playing a 15-year-old boy is next to a 15-year-old boy playing someone who's about to die of old age. So all these things come together in really dynamic ways. Yeah. Barry, is it all right if I move kind of out of the detail we're in now and just ask a couple of kind of questions towards the end of our conversation about essentially about your repertory, I suppose. So I think I'll ask both questions at once, and you can pick whether you want to answer both of them. But what is your repertory, and how do you feel about it? You have a gloriously eccentric repertory ranging across 60 to 80 years of the early modern period, ranging across different theatre companies, different writers, different stories, different tones, styles. And then my other question is, what do you get as a company from the plays of this period? Obviously, you're doing them because of the school's connection to Shakespeare. But if you remove that connection, is there anything about this particular period which draws you in or is exciting to work with? Those are two massive questions. Feel free to answer both, none, or one of them.
Well, I'll use my common approach, which is to ramble, and you can cut me off when good. The repertoire, as you say, is broad. It's probably that 80 years or so. I think the earliest play we've done was the most recent, which is Wit and Science, John Redford, which they think is the late 1530s. And then I think the latest one that we've done is that The Lady's Trial. So that's actually getting on for 100 years. Yeah. I've knocked one or two playwrights. I mean, Ford is a fantastic playwright, and I still am very proud of what we did with The Lady's Trial, but it's a difficult, complex, strange, weird play. I've knocked Westwood Hol as being kind of unfinished, or at least the version we have. More often, Andy, when we do these plays, for a start, you know that if you're working on a piece of performance, you have to fall in love with your work. You've got to. You make such a commitment to it. Everyone's got to buy into it. So we do fall in love with these plays, and the boys fall in love with their characters, and they really want to make it work. So there's inevitably that commitment that's going to be. But we come out of most of them feeling these plays are amazing, masterpieces, extraordinary. I mean, Chaste, Maid in Cheapside. Why isn't that play done more often? Mad World, My Masters, A Dutch Courtesan, The Malcontent. I know that's better known, but still, on and on and on, we come across these plays that are absolutely extraordinary and so full of possibilities, theatrical possibilities, linguistic possibilities, colour, life, music. We haven't even touched on music, and that's something that we use a lot, live music in performance. So it is extraordinary. I mean, to bend slightly into your second question, a sort of crunch of the gearbox, you said something along the lines that the connection is because we're Shakespeare's school. And the odd thing is that Shakespeare, of course, didn't write any of these boys' company plays at all. So he stayed with his single theatre company, even though it changed name throughout his career. And it was an adult company that would use boys to play female roles. He didn't do what Middleton and Johnson and Marston and Lilly and so on were doing.
As far as we know.
So, sorry?
As far as we know.
Yeah. That's interesting. Do you think there's one snaffled away somewhere?
No,
but, we've said it all the time. Just because you discover a play like A Mad World, My Masters, that I think is a masterpiece and an amazing and brilliant play, it doesn't mean that Shakespeare is therefore less good. And sometimes people seem to want to defend Shakespeare at the expense of these other playwrights. And it just means that there was more going on than maybe people have suspected in the past. And other people were creative too, and imaginative, and came up with really good ideas. Again, I talked about the way in which certain playwrights wrote for these companies. It doesn't seem to me, or to us, the boys working on the plays, that these companies were the sort of second best. Unfortunately, we can't get the King's Men to do this play, so there must be a boys' company around that can do it. It isn't like that, because Marston, Middleton, Johnson, Lilly knew what they could get from boys, what they could expect from boys. And I think based on things that scholars have said, that's one of the things that we've helped to unlock a little bit, that boys are capable of speaking long speeches. Boys are capable of doing more than simply parody. sort of Reg Folks thing from the 1970s. It's just aping the proper actors and so on. This idea of playing roles, I mean, it's what theatre's all about. So people who really got that, like Marston, Middleton, Johnson, it is quite extraordinary what they can get out of the boys. So I don't miss not doing Shakespeare at all. It's a breath of fresh air in the sense that we don't have that huge amount of expectation. You know, here's another Twelfth Night. Much as I love Twelfth Night, and I'd love to go and see a fantastic production again. But you know, if we're doing a play like The Woman in the Moon, well, there aren't many women in the moon around, apart from James Wallace's wonderful production. But it was so nice to be able to do a different take on that play and to explore it with someone like James, and who came to see the show, and I saw his show, and we could look at it and say, yeah, they're totally different, and bring out really different things, but isn't it a great play? Yeah. So that's part of the fun for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the things that's hard to get your head around in this period is that it's the boy companies who are often the prestige company at this time. Yeah. They're the ones most strongly associated with the court. And often they're the companies everyone wants to be seeing, and not the adult companies. Yeah. It's important to remember. Woman in the Moon is a great example of that, and I'm hoping we'll be able to show some images from your production and James's production as part of this. Video. One of the great things we were able to do a couple of years ago was to see that play in both of your productions, and to see adult and boy companies working with this material. One last thing I'll say before I ask my final question is that you've mentioned Westwood Ho a few times. And again, for anyone unfamiliar with this material, I feel I should clarify that Ho in this instance is a kind of early modern equivalent of kind of yo or hey or let's go. And is that play title is mimicking what you would say to a boat pilot to get down the Thames. Take me Westwood Ho. Like in the 20th century, an actor would jump into a car and say, follow that cab. That's the equivalent of that, I guess.
You're aware of your audience. Yeah. And Westwood, they want to go Westwood because that's where Brentford is in relation to the City of London. Brentford had the reputation a little bit like, I don't know, Brighton perhaps used to have in the mid-20th century. It's the place where you go for a dirty weekend, and you take your lover away. So Westwood Ho has within it the sense of hockey.
Everyone wants to go to Brentford. Harry, the final question then we're asking everybody is whether the word literature has value to them, whether it is something that it's a word which exists in their professional or personal lexicon. Is it a useful word, an unhelpful word, where it stands for you in your work? What do you reckon?
That's a really interesting and appropriate question. You know, I'm an English teacher, so you know it pays the mortgage. I'm lucky in the sense that the job I do is also my hobby, and I don't mean particularly putting on plays, although that is also a hobby, but just playing around with language and reading and teaching and exploring language. So for me, I'm always dominated by, it's kind of appropriate this year, isn't it, by Wordsworth's view of what poetry was, which was a way of encapsulating experience in words. So when I'm teaching, I'm always talking about a verbal machine. The poem is a bit like a verbal machine. It's made up of words, and with a machine, you put stuff in one end and something comes out the other end, just like a sausage machine or whatever it is. But people, whether they're writing poetry or prose, but people who are writing poems encapsulate the experience, usually a remembered experience in the case of Wordsworth, and there it sits on the page, and actually it's of no use to anyone there. And it's only when you open the book and you read it and engage with it imaginatively that those words start to do their job, and they turn into this machine, and it brings it alive again. All those concerns and struggles and humour and wit and connections all come alive because you are engaging with somebody who's written this poem. And of course, it doesn't have to be 250 years ago and part of the prelude. It can be written yesterday or whatever. So for me, it's that the way that language encapsulates experience that's really exciting.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you for putting words into our verbal machine.
I saw what you did there. That's really good, Andy. You should do this again. Yeah.
We should totally do this again. Thank you very much, Perry. It's a joy to speak to you.
Yeah, and you. Thank you so much, Andy. Bye.
Take care.